So normals, it's one of those concepts that a lot of people use them, even people with a lot of experience, they use them and they use them proficiently with no problems, and they know how and when to apply them. But from my experience, people don't really understand what normals are and what they can do for them in terms of coming up with different solutions for certain situations or certain types of problems. And because they don't understand it, they don't know how to tackle certain problems, and maybe if they would understand normals a bit better, they'll be able to tackle and to untangle themselves a bit better from certain problems. So let's talk about what normals really are. So in this situation, as an example, I have a sphere that is textured with a certain texture. It doesn't really matter. And if we go on the 3D scene, I've put some vertical lines coming from the center of our sphere, and this will be the actual thing to illustrate what normals are. So a normal is a vector, and I'm not getting into what a vector is at the moment because it goes outside the scope of what I'm trying to explain to you here. But it's a vector that it's perpendicular to the surface within the point you selected on that surface. So for example, this guy here is perpendicular to the actual surface of the point you've selected. The word perpendicular or normal, it's the same. That means that it makes 90 degrees with that surface. So this angle here, it's 90 degrees. And because this is a surface, there will be a really big number of these normals around the sphere, because every single point you select, in this case, because it's a graphical representation, every single pixel will have its own normal. Okay, so this is the representation of what a normal is in the 3D space. If you understood what I just said, that's another way to say that the direction of that face will also be defined by the actual normal of that surface. So this will help us in a lot of different situations if you understand this concept. Now we're going to take a look at what's the graphical representation of a normal. So if I now shuffle the normal from the 3D scene, we're going to have this representation. And this is a mix of RGB colors. And again, although people use this to normally do relights, because of course we know that if we go around the channels, we will hit different parts of the sphere and we can use them as masks to relight our subject. It's very useful to understand what these colors are. Okay, so first of all, let's establish one thing that is super important, which is the normals in a graphical representation. They go always between -1 and 1. That's how they behave numbers wise. If you look at the numbers here, if you select any point here, you'll see that there's no point going above 1, no matter where you place the sphere or how big the sphere is or whatever. And what's important to retain here is the reason why we have different colors. It's because it's coordinates of each vector that comes out from that surface given a certain point that you selected. Okay, let's say that I've selected this point here. Normals wise, this will be a vertical thing like this. This will be our N vector, that's the notation. And there will be a certain contribution to every single axis in which this vector is coming out of. So how can this vector be defined in space? In order for us to define that, we have to have a Cartesian reference. And the Cartesian reference is going to be something like this, okay? X, Y, and Z. And this Cartesian reference, it's placed in the center of our world. Normals, if not described otherwise, it's always referred to the world position. And by world position, what I mean by this is, if you go to your 3D world, you can see that this sphere, because it was created like that, is right at the center of our world. And that's why when we look at this Cartesian is at the center of our world, which coincides in this case only with the center of our sphere as well. But the sphere can go around the world anyway, but the Cartesian reference will always be placed at the center of our world. There will be other types of normals. For example, normals refer to the camera space, and there will be something different, but let's not mix that concept yet. But it's basically a different reference to which we are referring our normals to. In this case, it's world, and unless it's specified differently, it's always against the world that we need to define that same normal. So in this case here, if we have something like this, we need to define that same vector in terms of what's the contribution of every single axis in our Cartesian reference. Although I just said that we're not going to get into what a vector is, there's a couple of things that it's important to establish for your better comprehension on the following example. which is a vector is composed by two components. One of them is the magnitude, which is the same thing as saying length, and the other one is direction. It's actually the direction that we care about in this example. And knowing that, it's possible to place the same vector anywhere we want in space. As long as it respects these two components, the vector is still valid for the calculations that you want to do with it. For example, in this case, I could have placed this vector anywhere in space as long as it respects the actual same length and the same direction. In this case, it's not even respecting the same length. Of course, this is just hand drawing, but we can see that this one is shorter than this one. So of course, these two couldn't be equivalent, but let's assume that they have exactly the same direction. And for the following example, direction is actually all we care about. Even though I'm choosing this one to illustrate the following examples, bear in mind that a vector can be placed anywhere in space. So when I'm taking coordinates from this vector, the same coordinates could have been taken from anywhere in space, but the relationship within them, within these three axes, they will always have the same level of contribution between them to define the direction of this vector. And again, direction is all we care about in this example. So we have our Cartesian reference. That means that this vector can be defined with a certain contribution of probably every single axis. Why? Because here we can say that we have a contribution on y of a certain value, and we have also a contribution on the x with a certain value as well. And maybe, even though we cannot see in this flat representation of a 3D point, maybe we will have something or some contribution from the z-axis that is coming towards us. There's probably a certain angle in which this certain vector has towards us. Of course, again, with this 2D representation, we cannot see it, but maybe there's some. So that's when you look at the values, if we look at this value here, you'll see that we have a contribution of around 0.23 value-wise on the red channel. So that will be this value here. We will have a contribution of 0.24 on the y-axis, okay, which is more or less the same. And we have a contribution of 0.39 on the z-axis. So there's definitely an angle towards us, okay? So this will be the vertical portion or the vertical contribution on this axis, hence the green color. It's always red, green, and blue. It's always x, y, and z. So there will be that contribution on the y, there will be a certain contribution on the x, and there will be also a certain contribution in this case on the z. And that's why we have a mix of all these colors. If we have only contribution of one color, there will be something only with one color. And we're going to establish something here, which is if the angle that this normal has with a certain axis, if that angle is 90 degrees, that contribution will be 0. If it's 0 degrees, that contribution will be the maximum, which will be 1. And if it's 180 degrees, it's going to be the opposite of 1, which is minus 1. Let me give you an example. If we have a vector that is right at the axis like this vector will make 90 degrees with the x-axis and will make 90 degrees with the z-axis, right? So its contribution will be the maximum because there's no angle between the actual vector and where it's seated in terms of where the y-axis is. So it will have a maximum contribution on y, and the maximum we know that it's 1. So we know that on the y, which is a green channel, it will be 1. And it will have 0 contribution on the x because it makes 90 degrees. And it will have a 0 contribution on the z-axis because it's also 90 degrees. If on the other hand, the vector was here, okay, so if it was here, it will be the same thing except contribution on the y will be minus 1 and the other ones will be still 0. Let's not forget that normals always vary between minus 1 and 1. That's the range of values that they will have. So this means that now we understand what normals are, and maybe now that we know exactly what they are, maybe there's a certain number of things that we can do with them, and that's what we're going to take a look at. If the world is our pivot point, and by pivot point I mean it's our world axis, and that's what I call pivot point. What if we need or we would like to change the pivot point to be something else? If we do that, that means that we could access parts of the sphere that otherwise we won't be able to access. For example, the occluded part that we don't see. How can we change the pivot point? Let's take a look at something. So any object in the 3D space inside outside NUKE will have, of course, a translation, rotation, and scale. Same thing with the uniform scale, skew, and pivot, and all that stuff. But all these changes will be translated into something that is called the world matrix. So the translation, rotation, and the scale will be also defined by a certain number in this 4x4 matrix. So if you go up, you'll see that this value here is changing. If you go up in this one, you'll see that this one will change. And if we go up and down with the Z, you'll see that what's defining the translation in this matrix, it's actually the last column. If we change things in the rotation, you'll see that a bunch of values will change because there are sines and cosines being taken in consideration in all these variables in here in this part of this 3x3 matrix. So you'll see that this will change like that. So this means that this 3x3 matrix will be the part of the matrix that will be defining the rotation on any object in space. And the last column will be the part of this 4x4 matrix that will be defining the translation. At the same time that we know this, there's a node called color matrix that I'm not going to get into what's the operations that it does. But if you take a look, there's some resemblance between these two. You can see that this part of this matrix, okay, the world matrix, it's also a 3x3 in here. So that means that if we would like to change something color-wise, first of all, we have to have the reference in which there's no transformations at all. This is called the identity matrix. Okay, there will be no transformations if we have a value of 1 in its diagonal. So now if you plug this here, there will not be any changes. Okay, if you don't have any value, you'll see that everything will be pretty much 0. Okay, so you need to have a diagonal in order for us to be your starting point. Okay, in the same way that if you open an axis or a card or anything that is a 3D object, within the world matrix you also have 1 1 1 1. So this is like the starting point for you to do any transformations. So because we have this thing in common, we can link each element of this 3x3 portion of the matrix to this matrix in here. If we do that, we'll be able to change the rotation of our pivot point, taking the translation, rotation, and scale in any way we like. So this will be the representation of a 3D object in a 3D world, and we can mimic that by changing the colors with the color matrix coming from a certain source, in this case our normals. So if we do that, let's put this to 0 0 0. That will be the same diagonal in here. So we're going to put the same values like this. We have to copy one by one. That means that now if you change something on the rotation on X, for example, you'll see that both values will change. So these values are going to be the same as these ones, which means that in terms of the graphical representation, you see that this is the center of our world. And now if you change the axis, if you rotate it in the x-axis, you'll see that the center is changing now. So you're now accessing what's happening below that region of our sphere. You can rotate it in any axis and you'll be able to access the portion of the image that otherwise, or the normals that otherwise you won't be able to access. You're effectively changing where your world space is, so you're changing the pivot point to be something else. Okay, so you're changing this in any direction you want. So now the center, it used to be here, now it's already here. So that means that if you flip between the channels, you'll see that now you have a different type of selection, where for example the blue used to be, taking the whole region. Now it's not taking the whole region because now the center of our world is actually in here, which means that this will be the maximum value in which we're going to have our vector coming from this direction. This is for the rotation. What about the translation? We know that the translation lives in here, so we can force something like this, but because we don't have a 4x4 color matrix, what we can have is a add node that we're going to open on all these channels. So now if you link this to the red and this to the green and this to the blue, there will be a translation. So now this will also change in that regards. So this will open a few more possibilities for you to do a more effective, simple relighting like this. Let's now take a look. On our axis is influencing the pivot point of our selection in here. Okay, this is the center of our world, so this will take the values as we know it, as we saw before. The more you go towards us, the blue channel is changing slightly because you're effectively changing the axis towards us, and it's because it's towards us, we know that it's the z-axis, so everything else is going to be more towards the blue color. If you go on the right, you see that now the center used to be there, Okay, so now we are looking past what used to be the center. So now the center is off center actually. Same goes to the upward, same thing. It's as if your camera was moving, but it's not. So now if you rotate, the same thing will happen. You're rotating the world in which your reference was, and this is actually what's happening. Just wanted to call your attention for something, which is if you understand it better, you can always change the polarity of both the color matrix and the add node by clicking the invert, and then on the add node, you're gonna actually multiply this by -1. Like that, it's going to be the same. You see that it's now moving in the way that you may find that probably would make a bit more sense to you. But again, it's exactly the same concept, just a different direction. So might change your way of seeing things, and that's why I want to give you this tip. So hopefully this will now give you a few more ideas and overall understanding of what normals are and what type of manipulation we can do with them to our benefit, especially in terms of, but not only, relighting. Let's not forget that even if you change the camera, this won't change the values of the normals whatsoever because it's the normals of the world. We still have the same pivot point, which is the world in which the sphere is seated. So it's important to distinguish both things in order for you to fully understand this, and hopefully you understood them now.